centurion, and he is perhaps one of the most unlikely sorts of persons to join with Christ and his disciples at this time. The Roman centurions were particularly despised by the Jewish leaders because, for one thing, they were pagans and idol worshippers, and they were the enforcers for the conquering and occupying Roman army. And they were, whatever the authority existed within the temple and within the Jewish faith, really the power was in the hands of the Romans to declare whether you existed or did not. So they were sometimes inappropriately brutal or arbitrary or oppressive, and they were not the kind of people that would have been particularly friendly with the Jews. And yet this centurion comes to Jesus and very humbly asks if he can heal his servant. And it is a preview of how the Gentiles are going to come to Christ without benefit of having been Jewish and having the Jewish law and prophets and traditions. And yet they were brought into the fold of Christ. And he came in sort of a different way. As a Roman soldier, he understood authority. And he understood that authority was not something that he possessed himself, but that was by virtue of his obedience to the authority above him, all the way up to the emperor, and then all the way up to heaven. And he realized that if he retired as a centurion, he wouldn't be able to go into a tavern and say, "All right, you men, line up. Everybody clear out. I want the bar to myself." They would have just laughed at him. But because the authority wasn't in himself, the authority was from above. And the authority was very important in the army, of course, because the Roman army was successful because of the unity of its forces. The military formations, the military strategies, which all depended on being able to obey orders and depended on trusting and respecting your leadership. And there was, you felt very fortunate if you had a great general you were under, and sometimes, the Roman soldiers would insist that their great general become the next emperor. They would carry him into even if he didn't want to be, they would carry him into the city. So this man was very secure in his own dignity and authority. It was really unusual that he would have come and humbly made request of somebody who was of this conquered nation. He was the authority, not the people they had conquered. And yet, as we heard in the gospel, that there would be sheep coming from other folds, and that his sheep would hear his voice. And there was something in this centurion that heard what he was looking for. He heard the voice of absolute authority. Someone that actually had authority over nature, over the whole material world. And he was humble to the point he said, no, don't come to my house. I'm unworthy. I know about authority. I know if you give the order, it'll be followed. If you say he's healed, he will be healed. And thus it was. And then the Lord marveled at his faith. Now, what must it take for God to marvel? Who has seen everything there is to see, except someone as faithful in this man and amongst his own people. And he did not question this man as to, well, what do you actually believe, or what do you mean you're unworthy, and what is your house really like? Is it full of gods and things? And what is this? Why are you so interested in this young man? What kind of relationship do you have? He didn't, He said, you have faith. You see who I am, and who sin to beatitudes. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. There was something, great integrity in this man. And so he saw the power of God in Jesus Christ. And in fact, many of the early Christians did come out of the army. And there was reason for this. They admired certain things. They certainly admired courage. And when they saw the courage of the martyrs, whether they were old men like St. Ignatius, or whether they were young virgins, 12 years old, they stood up to tremendous torture. A soldier knew he might be captured and tortured, and he can't betray his brothers. They knew about this, and they saw people do this that had no capacity and no reason, as far as they could tell, to endure such terrible punishment and never deny their master. And in some cases, the soldiers would just walk up and say, well, I believe in this too. And of course, they would immediately be killed. And most of the soldiers, at some point, had to face the choice between serving the emperor or serving God, and they became martyrs. But what else attracted them to this message of Christ? Soldiers don't generally fight for some big cause. They fight for their brothers in arms. And there's this great bond of brotherhood that exists between these soldiers who live together and fight together and really depend on each other to have each other's backs, and are willing to give their life for each other. And this is something that they saw in Christianity. They saw this bond of unity, this bond of brotherhood, this oneness of mind and heart. It was very impressive. And also, for soldiers, they like order, they like clarity, they like this chain of command, So it wasn't strange for them to be in some sort of church organization. And some of them stayed in the army because really, it's hard for us to imagine that sometime, that a Roman soldier could be at the same time be a Christian. But you have to remember, the Roman Empire was the power that kept some sort of peace and order and law in the world at that time. It's kind of like our country. For all its flaws, it is the best thing that we can come up with so far. And it's interesting because, as some of you might know, our patron saint, St. John Maximovich, he went to military school. He was trained to be a soldier. And by all accounts, he liked it, except for the compulsory ballroom dancing. And honestly, he wasn't going to be that kind of soldier. But he took to it. And I think it served him well, because in his career as bishop, he had to fight. He had to fight with his own bishops, his own clergy. He had to fight for what he knew to be right, what he knew to be God's will, what he knew to be good for his flock. He had to fight for his flock even to come here. He had to fight against government bureaucracy and stand by the door of the immigration office. And he would not go away day after day after day till they wore him down, because there were so many displaced people then that nobody cared about this group of Russians that was in the Philippines, and they weren't starving, they weren't dying, they were okay. And if he hadn't done that, I don't even know if this church would be here, because really we're indirectly descended from this flock that St. John brought over from first from China and then from the Philippines. So when I say fight, I don't mean he wasn't a belligerent, but he was steadfast for the truth. And not everybody liked this. You know, he was pretty tough. He is a soldier. But he is a soldier for Christ. And, you know, in his own life, you know, we make, I think, too much sometimes about his foolishness for Christ, because he was incredibly disciplined, had a very rigorous schedule of prayer and services. Plus, he administered a large diocese that was pretty unruly, and then he would make hospital visits every single day to every person in his diocese that was in the hospital. He would go see them, and anybody else who wanted to talk with him. And then he would stay up all night praying besides. So when did he sleep? Well, he mostly didn't. And I don't think this is supposed to be a model for us, to not sleep. I'm pretty sure it's one of the reasons that he didn't live to be an old age. He literally wore himself out, gave his life for the flock. And I think that the foolishness for Christ, so, I mean, sometimes he would do some fairly outrageous things to make a spiritual point. But as a bishop, you know, he could not act like a person who had lost their mind. And he's a good administrator. He's very organized. He also went to law school. So he wasn't just someone that came out of the desert in his rags and unruly hair and you know, ruled in some sort of intuitive way. And I don't think he was universally liked. You know, he was kind of unkempt, you know, because he just was not that. I think he's very busy for one thing. Just didn't care that much about external things. I'm sure some of the women in the congregation understand. He would go by there. They were very upset. They would have liked to have a bishop that was tall and dignified and well-dressed and talked without a speech defect. But you know, we don't know. You know, we don't know how we would have responded to the real St. John. We don't know. He's very tough, very strict. Remember, when we were young, we didn't like that. You know, people telling us what to do or what not to do. But he did it because he loved Christ and he loved the church, and he knew the times we were living in that someone had to sort of hold the line. It was almost like someone came from another era, another age, to come and preserve the faith for us. And so, for all that, he was incredibly loving, especially towards children. We know that he started 2 different orphanages, and he was very concerned with the safety and the health and the upbringing of children, and liked to be with them and tell them stories and tell them about the saints and hold them on his lap. And he was not necessarily warm and fuzzy to everyone. I spoke to someone who was a very elderly man that was at one time was his cell attendant, and we asked him, well, what was it like to be with St. John all the time? And he said, what was it like? It was like battery acid. Me and my friend, we looked at this and they go, do we want to continue this conversation? But I've thought of it since. And what does battery acid do? You know, it acts on lead, you know, and creates power. And it's very corrosive. It just cuts through the crud, you know. So, and I don't think that was so much his personality. It's just, I imagine being around him all the time, it was like being in the presence of God all the time, you know, which we are, but we're blessedly not aware of it all the time. But if you were right on him like that, I imagine, you know, out of that little 5'3" body exuded great power, great authority. So he was a very complex and unusual individual, as are most saints. And the work that he began, continues on, and we are so blessed to have him as our patron and to have his blessing that we might go on with the mission which was the mission at the end of his life, to bring Orthodox Christianity to the barbarian lands. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.